Manufacturers on the cutting edge of their respective industries all seem to have one thing in common. They're either innovating new products or new categories of products, or they're watching what their consumers are building and modifying and simply producing that right from the factory. The best example of this type of forward-thinking and direct response to consumers' demands at the moment is the 174-inch mountain segment. Competition is always good. If nothing else, it certainly highlights the high and low points of the competing vehicles. Before the RMK, the Summit 174 was the only 174-inch factory mountain sled you could get, so by default, it was the best. Now though, it has a competitor that it can be put up against. This will undoubtedly reveal anything that's not perfect with either sled. We're going to stick to our usual method of doing a shootout by looking at a number of different test categories and then comparing both vehicles in each. The vehicle that wins the highest number of categories at the end of it all gets our nod. The categories we feel are most important for a 174-inch mountain sled are weight, durability, power, handling, suspension, and overall layout and design. By shedding material anywhere it was not needed, Polaris's Axis RMK has achieved the title as the lightest mountain sled in pretty much every class, including this one. But sometimes a design feature or piece of technology requires a trade-off in the weight department, and sometimes that trade-off is well worth it. Skidoo felt the benefits of their T-Motion suspension system, heavier though it might be, were worth the trade-offs, and, despite the extra poundage, actually make the sled easier to ride. So which is it? Is the RMK easier to ride because it's lighter, or is T-Motion so good it makes up for being heavier? When we took the time to break this question down to its very core, the answer was this. The difference in ease of handling between the lighter RMK and the heavier Summit isn't enough to justify the extra weight, so 1 point RMK. Now let's talk about durability. This is a big one, because there's really nothing worse than being stranded out in the backcountry with a broken sled while your buddies are still out playing in the trees. The RMK has been built with lightweight in mind, but with an equal focus on durability. Material was only removed from places where it would not sacrifice strength. Lighter materials were used in places where previous parts could not otherwise be made lighter. Take the forged A-arms for example. Lighter, but just as durable, if not more so, than steel. The end result of this is a sled that's extremely rigid, which doesn't just make the sled more capable of taking a beating, but it also makes it easier to ride and makes it more capable of taking a hit without buckling a major component. The Summit X174 is built in a more traditional manner, using aluminum in most places with a few bits of exotic metal mixed here and there. It's no secret that the bulkhead, or the flying nun, on the XM chassis can be bent a lot more easily than it should be. The front end of any sled is the most vulnerable part during an impact, and having a weakness here is definitely not ideal. This fact is well known to Skidoo to the point that they started using thinner tubing on the front A-arms to create a failure point other than the bulkhead. The truth is, a bent front bulkhead on a Skidoo usually isn't enough to end your day, but it is an absolute pain to fix. The Axis chassis isn't known to have any areas of glaring weakness though. Aside from the bulkhead, the Summit is a very tough snowmobile, but we simply can't say it's the most durable with an issue that's as well known as this one. So, the Axis grabs its second point in the durability category. Next up, let's talk about power. When you throw a 174-inch track spinning 3-inch lugs onto a mountain full of heavy snow, it becomes more necessary than anywhere else to have big power on tap. Luckily, both of these sleds are not at a power deficit in any way. The Summit X174 is powered by Skidoo's legendary E-Tech 800HO mill that puts out a claimed 160 horsepower at sea level. Anyone who's ever ridden a sled with this power plant under the hood knows it's a force to be reckoned with. But more than just powerful, the real beauty of the 800 E-Tech is how it runs. The ultra-precise fuel delivery of the E-Tech system translates into smooth and predictable power delivery at any throttle setting. It also does a fantastic job of compensating for altitude. If there's one thing everybody can agree on, it's that E-Tech works. Last season, Polaris completely reworked their 800 engine to get even more horsepower and torque than ever before. A lighter crank, electronically controlled exhaust valves and oil pump, perfectly tuned intake and exhaust, and a genuine set of V-force reads are the main talking points here. Our best guess in terms of horsepower would be somewhere around 100 to 165 at sea level. The most impressive attribute of this 800 engine though is how much power it has down low. The Cleanfire 800 literally grunts at you when you blip the throttle, but it's not like a bull ready to bolt. It's like a big Clydesdale horse, just ready to smoothly move mountains anytime you need it to. These engines needs to make any excuses to anyone. They both have Herculean torque and they run great. But at the end of the day, when you're facing a huge vertical chute, you're going to want to have as much horsepower on tap as you can possibly get. And everybody who's ridden both of these sleds agrees, the Polaris feels like it has more power. So that's 3 points for the RMK. Polaris claims that because the RMK is light and rigid, it's easier and requires less effort to ride. There's absolutely no question these two attributes definitely are pluses when it comes to handling, and they combine to make a sled that is, as Polaris puts it, extremely flickable. We like flickable a lot, but Skidoo describes the handling of the Summit 174 as effortless, and since we're pretty lazy, that appeals to us just as much. We also completely agree with that description. T-motion is incredible in how little effort it requires to pull the sled over and keep it over on its side. There's no question the RMK is a good handling snowmobile, but a Summit equipped with T-motion is simply better, so the Summit gets its first point. Suspension isn't something most people talk a lot about when it comes to long track, big paddle mountain sleds. It seems many assume that because snow is pretty soft, suspension doesn't matter as much, and they're what we like to call wrong. The Pro RMK 174 is equipped with Walker Evans comp adjustable piggyback shocks up front and on the rear arm. They offer total adjustability and come tuned perfectly for mountain slayage. On the flip side, the Summit comes with a pretty basic set of shocks that, while they're tuned very well, are not adjustable at all. Why do this, you might ask? The best answer we can come up with is that they are light. And yes, light is right, but we think suspension isn't something that should be cheaped out on. With that said, we found the 174 RMK seems to have some trouble lifting its nose in the deep snow. It's not a flotation problem, it seems to be a weight transfer problem that is not present on shorter Polaris mountain sleds. The Summit lifts its nose on command. Lofting the front end of the Summit is easy, which makes it a heck of a lot more fun to play with in the powder. Ergonomically speaking, the Summit shouldn't do this better than the RMK due to its rider's weight being so far forward, but there's no question the Summit likes to get its tips up, and that's just more fun. So despite having an inferior shock package, we think the lighter front end feel of the Summit gives it the edge in the suspension department. Our final area of comparison is overall layout and design. This category includes things like chassis layout, bodywork, rider positioning, and ergonomics. The RMK is built off Polaris' latest Axis platform. The bodywork is sleek and is designed to prevent drag when the sled is on its side and to prevent paneling out when things get steep. Rider positioning is forward, but not excessively so, and bar height is on the high side compared to its competition. The engine is placed low in the chassis, so its center of gravity is low as well. As discussed before, the more rearward rider positioning would lead you to believe the sled would be easier to wheelie, but that's just not the case. The Summit has what we would describe as extreme rider forward positioning. It feels like you're almost standing right on the front of the sled. The 174 version remains in the XM chassis, which has bodywork that's not nearly as sleek as the new G4. The bars are lower than those of the RMK, but the engine isn't positioned as low. Overall, the Summit gets mixed reviews when it comes to ergonomics. Some love it, some start out not liking it and end up liking it more the more they ride it, and others just never get comfortable with it. In this category, the more universally appealing ergonomics, sleeker bodywork, and lower center of gravity combine to leave us with no other choice but to give the RMK the final point, which gives it a total of 4 out of 6 overall. In this shootout, Polaris' Axis Pro RMK 174 is the clear winner, and it's extremely deserving of its new title as SnowTrax TV's best 174-inch mountain sled for 2017. But it just doesn't seem right to end this story without a few further observations. The Axis RMK is the latest and greatest chassis from Polaris. Skidoo's X174 Summit remains in the older XM chassis, and it shows. The new G4 Summit addresses almost every area where the XM fell behind the Axis in this test. Skidoo's explanation for not putting the 174 in the G4 chassis for 2017 is simply that time didn't allow them to do it all at once. But that seems like a strange excuse when you figure that the 165 Summit is a G4 and the 174 is just a 165 with a longer skid frame. It seems to us like it would have been very easy. It's become pretty evident that had this test been between Polaris's Axis Pro RMK 174 and a Skidoo Summit X 174 in the new G4 chassis, the results could have been different. I'm not saying the Summit would have won. What I am saying is that the results would have been a lot harder to determine.
If you enjoyed the video that you just watched, like it and then subscribe to our page for more great content from SnowTrax TV.